While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust, and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Perhaps you're familiar with the quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." While its use in the movie The Usual Suspects might resonate with most, the original attribution goes to French poet Charles Baudelaire. The quote came to mind in preparing for my conversation with Tim Chase. He's the principal technical evangelist for Orca Security. You see, I knew we were going to be discussing things like zero trust and cloud security, and where the biggest implementation challenges typically resonate from OT asset owners who don't see the need to address these topics because they don't feel their organization is significant enough to be targeted. Or, with all due respect to Baudelaire, the greatest trick hackers ever pulled was convincing the industrial sector that they didn't care. Numerous reports showing ongoing spikes in cybersecurity incidents at manufacturing plants, utilities, and logistics providers should be enough to open everyone's eyes. But they're not. And even more troubling is that due to greater levels of supply chain integration and overall connectivity, it only takes one weak link to bring everything crashing down. So even if you've taken precautions, a weak partner can put you, your data, your IP, and your people at risk. The good news is that folks like the aforementioned Tim Chase are aware of these situations and they're working to offer some pretty cool solutions. So Tim, thanks so much for the time and welcome to Security Breach. So let's kick off talking a little bit about cloud security. This is kind of one of the biggest challenges in industrial side of things, just because there's this sort of misnomer that we're working with this big cloud provider. They've taken care of all these security things for me, and we know that's not necessarily the case. So maybe we can start there and just talking about how we can get past that a little bit and get folks a little bit more aware of what they need to do when it comes to the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at industrial security in general, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen is that historically, they have been a little bit behind technology, right? So they don't update the devices. They kind of just sit in isolation. And so as they have moved to the cloud and we have kind of this concept of industrial devices connecting to this larger cloud, they don't necessarily have an understanding of what's going on, right? And so we've talked about the shared responsibility model for a long time now, but that's just something that I think they don't quite understand yet. And so they don't understand necessarily who's responsible for what. And so that's really where I tend to start, right? Whenever I'm educating teams or security leaders that are responsible for these systems in cloud security, is basically saying like, look, you're still responsible kind of for the devices themselves. You're responsible for the network connections that connect to the cloud. But once you're in the cloud, like let them do the hard work of securing the servers, securing the services themselves, and just kind of really dividing and helping them understand what's that dividing line of what I need to care about. And to me, it comes back to education a lot, which I know all security is about education, but I think in an area where maybe security has been lacking and a little bit behind, there's a little bit more education that's needed to kind of push them to understand what the cloud is and how it can help them.
Is it more when it comes to understanding who's responsible? Is it from an internal inside the company versus the external provider of the services? Or is it even internally where they're trying to figure out whose job it is, if it's IT or OT or whomever?
I think it's a combination of both. I think from an internal perspective, like they have to understand whose responsibility is, because they have to understand how the technology works, right? So I think, it's up to them to know kind of where that dividing line is. it is up to the technology vendor or the outside vendor to, I think, educate them on maybe how you can secure things by default, if that makes sense, right? So I think the industrial control systems and those in the past have been lacking a little bit. Maybe they're just kind of wide open because the view was, it's an internal network, everything is segregated. So I don't have to worry about security. So I think it's kind of a combination of both things. It's the internal folks understanding more about the devices and how they connect and how to secure it. But I also think it's up to the device manufacturers themselves to really say, okay, here we're going to be secure by default. And here are the things that you can change to work with inside of your network. But I do think ultimately the responsibility has to be with the people of the company themselves.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's understanding. It's a lot of it's just communication and not making assumptions about what's going on and who's covering what, overlapping if we need to, just to make sure. And I think in a lot of cases, this also bleeds into a corporate culture when it comes to cybersecurity. We talk about this a ton on Security Breach. But from your perspective, what separates some of those who have that positive culture and those who are still working to get there? Are there certain steps or best practices that you've seen in certain companies implement?
I think sometimes what separates us is it being a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. The most successful security organizations that I found and that I've led have had the buy-in from the leaders. When you have, the executives, the CEO, the board, the CIO, whatever it happens to be, when they truly have an understanding of security and what needs to happen, and that really kind of helps facilitate the culture change that needs to happen. When I've talked with other CISOs that are struggling, I'll say like, what's going on? Why are you struggling? And they're like, well, the engineering team doesn't want to do security because we're slowing them down, or, they don't want to fix all the vulnerabilities that we find because they can't fit it into their sprints. But when you ultimately try and be like, well, why? It's because they don't have the buy-in of the right level of leadership, right? They're more concerned with maybe getting the product out or meeting their goals. But when I've went in someplace, I've always kind of won the hearts and minds of those executives, right? And say, look, if we don't secure this, right? If I don't have your buy-in to make sure that we always get sprint time, or that we can make sure that critical findings are always, prioritize, then I think they can understand, and that really helps kind of push it. And then all of a sudden, everybody is kind of held accountable for cybersecurity. And part of this, I'm sure you've talked about a lot. One of the key ways to doing it is just to translate kind of these security requirements into business objectives, right? To understand, like, look, if we're breached, whether it happens to be for one of these industrial control systems, if it's in the cloud, or what have you, like, here are the business ramifications that we have, right? The federal government may be upset, or our customers might be upset, or whatever it happens to be. Just kind of doing that translation and making it more real life impact, I think, has been the key to me. And then ultimately, when you have that kind of that top-down approach, that enables you to do things like the Security Champions program, right? Which has been very successful. And if you look at one of the cloud providers themselves, like if you look at AWS, every time that I've talked to a lot of their security team before, they talk about their internal Security Champions program. And the reason that it's successful, and the reason that they've been able to do it, is because, all the way from the CEO down, they have the CEO's ear when it comes to security and the things that they need to care about.
Yeah. Well, I think, using AWS as an example, I think it's easy to get that top-down type of buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to uptime in an operational environment, a manufacturing environment, it's sort of a double-edged sword with cybersecurity, because on one side, you can see why those folks on the plant floor want to keep things up and running. You can also warn them about the downtime that can be created with a cyber attack. Just looking at the Land Rover Jaguar situation right now.
Yeah.
So in assessing those types of situations, again, we like the bottom down. It's easier to get people to buy in. When it's coming the other way, is there a way that you've maybe given some tools to people that they can get that C-suite to start buying into these cybersecurity programs that we need?
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes to me around education. So when I've had to kind of do it at that level, one of the things that I've done is maybe have lunch and learns, right? Where I have paid for lunches for during their lunchtime and had them come in and given a presentation, right? I know it's probably cliche, but like security is everyone's responsibility. Like if you look at a lot of where a lot of breaches happen today, the human factor is very much involved. And so one of the things that I have done is educate the people and meet them where they are, right? Not just dictate what I want from a cyber exec, but going to them and saying, look, here are some of the things that can affect you, and here's what it would do to the entire plant, right? Like I know that maybe cybersecurity isn't in your day in and day out, but if you fall for this type of phishing email, then and you get malware inside of our plant, this is where it can go and this is how it can affect, right? And so to me, it's about education, but not just like generic education where you come in and they click through a series of videos, but like very specific pointed education that matters to them. Like I've talked to some training companies today, and like they're even tailoring a lot of their cybersecurity education to be more business focused, like cybersecurity education for developers, for finance, to avoid those wire fraud type of things. And I think the same thing that you could do might apply to maybe these more industrial level folks that are working the floor, right? It's speaking the language of where they're at, because that's where I grew up. Just to be honest, like I kind of came from that level, and so did my parents. And so, cybersecurity is just not at the forefront of their minds. It is now because I talk about it all the time. But like, in the past, like that's not really what they want to think about, right? And that's just not kind of their day job. So just meeting them kind of where they are and explaining why what they do matters and the impact that it can have. That's kind of the bottom up approach that I take. And I typically will do both. Like it's not one or the other. I think, you can develop kind of those security champions naturally by having those conversations and by doing the training and feeding people. Like anytime that you get people and you give them lunch or whatever, or coffee, like you get people to show up, right?
No, absolutely. That is tried and true throughout any type of training environment, free food and drink. Yes. Absolutely. But right. I like what you mentioned there, a lot about getting that buy-in and showing people how they're having an impact on the business, both from a positive, but potentially, if we do the wrong stuff here, a negative way. I think a lot of that education can also come from the fact that a lot of these social engineering campaigns are getting a lot more sophisticated. The hackers are getting a lot smarter in what they're doing and a lot more advanced in their tactics. We all know this is the case, but maybe you could share a little bit of your experience in terms of what you've seen and how these attacks have become more advanced, more elevated.
Yeah, absolutely. Back, I would say maybe 8 or 9 years ago now, right, is where I first started to see it a little bit more, where it was kind of the classic gift card scheme that happens at Christmas, right, where the boss is too busy to talk, so go buy these, $1,000 worth of gift cards. And I think those still happen. But what I have seen these days is really sophisticated attacks. And a lot of them are fed or curated by AI, right? And so that's one of the things that I would also kind of mention to people, because I think everybody, although AI itself can be a little bit complicated, I think even non-technical people can understand how AI can be used to be harmful, especially when it comes to phishing. So I have seen some of these attacks kind of shift where it's not this generic email where your CEO supposedly is sending you an email and you look at that and be like, well, he never signs his name that way. That's obviously not true, right? Now it's, well, you can see the email looks really same and the tone in which he or she writes is the same, right? And so what I'm starting to see now is that you can use AI, and attackers are using AI to understand, whether it's through LinkedIn posts or articles or whatever it happens to be, they can go and they can get a general sense of how a particular person writes and then use that in the phishing campaign, so that when it comes to you, you're like, oh, well, that's exactly how they would communicate, right? And so maybe you don't think twice like you normally would when there are grammatical mistakes, if that makes sense. And that's really kind of where we're going. And I've seen a lot of companies that have kind of started up to really help in this space, right? Whether it's through the video type of fakes or whether it's just understanding kind of the email sort of fakes. But I think that's where I've seen it kind of really increase over the last year or two. It's really accelerating.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's no way we can have a conversation about almost anything right now without talking about artificial intelligence, but most definitely cybersecurity. We know how the bad guys are using it, or we've got a good feel for how they're using it to manipulate us further. But the good guys are also doing some positive things with AI, and I think it's important to discuss that as well. What have been some of the advancements that you've seen either at Orca or other places where we're using AI to help reinforce a lot of things we want to do from a defensive perspective?
Yeah, great question. So I think some of the ways obviously is it helping understanding and sorting through vast amounts of data. At Orca and other places, when you take in all of this data, well, what do you do with it? How do I make sense of it? Can I query against it? And so that's where I've seen AI kind of be able to help, which is, I've got all of this cloud telemetry data, let's say, right? That's coming in from 2 or 3 different cloud providers. And I'm monitoring, hundreds of thousands of workloads inside of these clouds. I've got my source code that's in there as well. And you have all of this data. Well, AI is a good way that you can query against it so that you can have an understanding of what to prioritize or what you have inside of your environment, by being able to say things like, hey, show me all of the S3 buckets where I have credit card data. And boom, there you have it, right? Super important when, especially like in the case of an incident. So if you're working an incident and historically one of the hardest parts for a SOC is to really understand where you might be impacted, right? You can say, oh man, I can tell that an attacker got through and I potentially got one compromised host. Well, what can they do from there? Like, where can they go? Where they can traverse? What kind of data can they access? Well, that's where AI can really, I think, be a good help, is because you can use that and say, show me all of the different data that can be accessed through this compromised role, or something along those lines. That's one area that I think AI has really helped. And then I think a couple of other areas is the learning curve. So, a lot of times when people are going to the cloud and they're starting to monitor cloud security or what have you, they may not know what an alert means, right? There's a certain learning curve. Well, AI is very good at being able to help you to learn. So if you get an alert that's telling you you have a specific attack or a specific misconfiguration vulnerability, and you're like, I don't really know what to do with it. This doesn't make sense to me, because maybe you're kind of a newer SOC analyst. You can query against that to understand how to action it, right? So because those LLMs have all of that data and be able to inform you. And then finally, what I would say is, we've heard about vibe coding a lot, but to kind of integrate that with security, and Orca can do this, and I think it's super powerful. It's like when you have a vulnerability that's found maybe in your infrastructure as code that you use to build your servers in the cloud. Well, how can I fix that? Well, you can have AI automatically generate that for you, right? And say, oh, well, here's what you would do, and here's the change request that you would need to submit to your code repository to make that change so that the vulnerability is gone.
Yeah, just making sure you do get a pair of human eyes on there before you plug it in. We've seen some
100%.
Hallucinations have some interesting impacts, but I would agree with you 100% in terms of how it can save time and sort through a lot of that stuff. And I think the first point you made is really important when it comes to sorting through and parsing a lot of that data, because where manufacturers in particular are still struggling is with that response part of their cybersecurity plan. So understanding what all these different attacks mean and how to respond to them, I think AI could be an incredible tool there, as well as also sort of helping them not develop this security, this fatigue from all these alerts that can be going on around them as well from all the different tools. So a lot of different ways AI can help streamline this and just help it to feel not so daunting at times to dig into a lot of these different vulnerabilities that may be present.
No, and you're spot on. And I think that, I mentioned a little bit earlier, maybe some of these industrial systems, maybe their cloud and their cybersecurity knowledge is just a little bit behind. But I think that's where AI can really help, right? Because they don't always have the money of some of the financial firms or some of the other ones. And so that's where AI can really kind of help you maybe you don't need as many SOC analysts to be able to analyze and do the searching because you have AI behind you enabling you to do that search. I think there's the opportunity there to be able to just help you do more with less, which is always I think a concern when it comes to these industrial systems.
I think across the board, especially when it comes to manufacturing and the industrial sector, don't get me wrong, there's definitely a deficiency when it comes to that in-house talent in handling cybersecurity. So having another tool like AI to help support that is huge. Do you feel that could even go beyond there in terms of addressing some of these shortfalls we have in terms of trained cybersecurity professionals to help plug in and help not just manufacturing, financial, healthcare, a lot of the other different segments as well?
No, I do. And I think it'll have multiple impact. I think it'll go kind of all to the different sectors. And I think we're seeing it accelerate, especially in maybe in some of the ones that are more cloud native, some of the financial banking ones that are all in on AI. And I think it'll really help you kind of accelerate and maybe once again kind of do more with less. And I think it'll really also help potentially some of these managed service providers, right? So you have a lot of the MSPs or, there are many different names for them, but the ones that kind of intake all of this data from different customers, well, that's going to help them scale their SOC analysts. So maybe instead of, needing 10, they can use 5. And I don't mean that to say that AI is going to replace people and we're not going to need entry-level folks. I think what my perspective is on it is just going to kind of take it up a level to what these entry-level folks can do, right? There'll always be beginning people in cybersecurity, whether that's people wanting to make a transition or people coming out of college. But I think that what AI will enable somebody to do in any vertical is maybe up the game a little bit and do more rather than, somebody just sitting there on a keyboard, searching through whatever SIM you might be using. They can do it quicker, they can do it faster and be more responsive to alerts.
No, I agree with you 100%. Using AI to parse the data and crunch the numbers and run all these situations through, and then allowing your human beings to actually strategize and develop response plans and things of that nature, they're going to be much more effective in the way you can allocate your resources. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree.
So circling back a little bit, Tim, we talked a little bit about vulnerabilities. I know you kind of focus more on the cloud than any place else when it comes to the industrial side, but are there more prominent vulnerabilities that you're seeing popping up on the cloud side that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we have really seen, I'm going to go back in history just a little bit, but with SolarWinds to me was kind of the start, a lot of these supply chain vulnerabilities. So it definitely affects the cloud. And I think the reason that we see it more in the cloud is because so many more people are storing their source code and their their IAC templates and all of this kind of things inside of the cloud, like GitHub, GitLab, in places like that. So the biggest trend that we are seeing, even in our research pod at Orca, is a lot of these supply chain attacks, where rather than having to hack firewalls and find their way into the systems, they're just completely getting around it, right? And I've been talking about this for a little while because, everybody knows SolarWinds several years ago kind of had a compromise where attackers were able to get inside of their source code management system, insert some malicious code, and then it wasn't caught and it was deployed to governments and industry, all over the world, right? And so we're seeing that kind of more and more now where I think the XZ vulnerability was one that we saw a couple of years ago. And that's what's kind of what we're starting to see a lot is instead of they're going straight to the source because open source is so pervasive. I've seen a lot of statistics of, sometimes 80% of an application can be open source software in some form or another. And then sometimes your open source uses open source, right? So that's really the biggest, one of the biggest trends kind of that I'm seeing in cloud security or security in general is just rather than focusing on hacking their way into the cloud or through firewalls, they're really kind of going around it by going straight to the source, so to speak, and changing the code to be malicious and using that to do malware, extract data, whatever it happens to be.
So at the risk of throwing just a bunch of buzzwords at you, I guess, does a lot of this stem from the fact that it's poor endpoint security, it's bad administrative, like managing logins and credentials? Is it is it more basic stuff, or is it more complex based on what the hackers can do now? What's really what should we be
I'm
doing
not going
better?
to, I think one of the things that we could be doing better is doing a better job um, on our open source security and just understanding what we're using and who is using what. That's one thing. I don't think it's one thing in particular. I think from a malware perspective and endpoint protection, they're still doing a pretty good job there, and we catch it. But I think they're just becoming more sophisticated. And a lot of times we don't always educate our developers and have them understand which source code, open source, that they should be using and what they can use, like in that particular case. And so I think we need to get more mature on that side of the house, right? Understanding what open source are you using, where are you using it, and how mature is that particular library, right? Is it something that one guy maintains once a year in some country, somewhere, right? Or is it something that has multiple maintainers? It's been a healthy open source project for 10 years. And that, and just kind of understanding the licenses that go along with that. The flip side of that I will say is, this is where Orca is pretty good as well, is just understanding in runtime, where are you using that open source? Where are you using those libraries, right? Because things will happen, right? It doesn't matter how many precautions you take. You could literally have the security team have to approve every open source project to be used, and something is still going to happen. That's just the very nature, right? But the key is, how quickly can you respond to an incident when it happens? When we find out that there's a log4j issue, right? Because that's a super popular open source library that was compromised a couple of years ago. Well, how quickly can we respond to that? And that's where having appropriate runtime alerting can help, right? Your normal endpoint isn't necessarily going to help you with that, but being able to have monitoring on your workloads inside of your cloud to be able to say, look, you have log4j here, and it's running, right? So something called reachability analysis, where Orca can look at it and say, hey, I can tell that this particular library is running or it's dormant, right? So I would say kind of having good processes on the left side, if you so to speak, in the development phase, but also having good processes on the right to understand what you're running and be able to react quickly when something does happen.
Yeah, and that's where in the industrial sector, and I'm sure it's across the board, we start talking about these S-bombs, more and more, those software bill of materials, and understanding what's running what, which everybody just wants to flee the room from. Nobody wants to dig into that stuff because it can be daunting. But when we talk about the use of AI or developing cybersecurity talent, it feels like being able to either detect the malware strains, because they're also open source and they're becoming more customized. So the hackers are really good at that, but we haven't kept up in terms of detecting all this different stuff, especially with all this open source software.
You're spot on. And that's where the old way of doing things doesn't work, right? Where you can never completely throw everything out, right? So signature detection for malware still needs to be here, because you're going to have beginners, you're going to have people that are still going to use it and whatever. But to me, it doesn't matter what industry that you're in. If you're monitoring your environment, you need to be able to look for specific patterns, right? To anomaly detection, so that when something happens that is unusual to happen, you're alerted. My perspective is, for the most part, certain behavior is always expected inside of your cloud environment. Like if you think about what you do from a day-to-day job, hosting a podcast or whatever you might be doing, you check email, you have a specific routine of what you do. There may be some things, some websites you visit that are abnormal. Well, even more to that, for the most part, workloads inside of a cloud, they tend to do something similar, right? It's, workload A talks to workload B and C. It doesn't ever talk to D. So if that happens, you should be alerted. On a workload, You always have a specific set of a service account. If a new service account is created, that's unusual, especially when it talks out to a new server, right? So being able to understand kind of the patterns that happen inside of your real estate of cloud or on-prem, and when deviations happen to that, being able to be alerted and notified, I think is the key to understanding kind of the next generation of detections, right? So the signature, that stuff's always going to be important, but I think for the new variants of malware that we're seeing, you really got to have that understanding of kind of what happens day in and day out for the anomaly detection.
Well, I think what you just laid out there makes a ton of sense too, and helps with another issue. And I'm not trying to, continue to reiterate this, but that alert fatigue becomes such a big deal in the SOC. Or if you don't have a SOC and you're a collective of individuals, 2 or 3 people monitoring these and constantly getting these alerts, you can get, immune to them a little bit, knowing that it's real when you get that, because there's a very real anomaly that was detected that you need to respond to. I think just helps strengthens the whole plan or the whole response dynamic as well.
I mean, you're spot on. I mean, two of the things that I hear the most when I'm talking with both leaders and practitioners one of them is alert fatigue. We have too many alerts. Like we spend 80% of our time going through false positives, and then it frustrates my team. It's not a good use of my team's time. So that is where, machine learning, AI, whatever it happens to be, that's where that can come in to help you understand that behavioral analysis. And it makes for happier teams, and it makes for more productive teams, right? Like, the same guy that's going to be frustrated seeing the same thing over and over, he's just going to hate the security tool and want to walk away. The other part of it that I will say, it kind of goes along with alert fatigue, but it's like vulnerability overload. We've got 2,000 items in our backlog. I don't even know where to start, so I'm not going to start anywhere, right? That's one of the things that I see as well. It's kind of the same thing, maybe a different team actioning them, but it's like, I don't even know where to start, man. You just connected me to all, 20 cloud accounts, and now I've got a backlog of 5,000 things I don't even know how to get to, right? So both of those things, I think, are common problems that we see in the cloud world across, all of the different verticals.
No, 100%. I'm sure there's a lot of people shaking their heads in agreement with us right now. Tim, I want to dive into some other things that have been brought up as well. But before we do that, maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about Orca Security and some of the stuff you guys are up to.
Yeah, absolutely. So Orca Security is a cloud security platform. So when you're going to the cloud, you need someone that can help you be efficient with managing your cloud security, right? Because cloud security, to me, can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be, right? And so when you look at the cloud, you can look at things like misconfigurations. Do I have ports wide open? You can also look at all of your workloads that you have running in your cloud. You can look at identity, which is like, do I have identities in my cloud that are over permissioned? What data do I have in my cloud? What's my software inventory? And what Terraform am I using? Can I do proper security scanning of my infrastructure as code or my security, my static code, right? So when you look at all of those things together, that's where a cloud security platform like Orca can help, because we take all of this data from your infrastructure, from your CSPs across multiple cloud service providers. And we can put all of that in one place that helps you make sense of it, right? Because all of it kind of goes into this unified data model where you can help query on it, and you can help prioritize what you should work on first. I know we've talked a lot about like alert fatigue or false positives. Well, that's where Orca comes in, because we can look at all of the vulnerabilities and say, you know what, focus on these top ones, because we can see that they are exploitable. We can see that they are available externally, and then they have sensitive data attached to them, right? So rather than be like a point solution that just focuses on vulnerabilities or just focuses on data security, we see the entire landscape of your cloud across multiple cloud providers to help you just understand your cloud security real estate and help you effectively identify, prioritize, and remediate your vulnerabilities in your cloud.
The prioritized part there, I think that is probably the biggest impact that you can have for a lot of organizations. Just because, like you said, you can be sick in a situation. Well, which of these 2,000 things do I go after first? So being able to prioritize them with a little bit more intelligence makes a ton of sense and can be super helpful. I would think.
Oh yeah, super helpful. That's what we hear from customers a lot. And so that's where we can help by being able to assign a rating to say, this one's got kind of this 97 risk level. You should look at that first because it's externally available, and it just gives your teams data that you can action on.
Absolutely. So, I'm going to throw a couple terms at you here, Tim, and these aren't new. They're not novel. They're definitely not exclusive to the cloud, but I think sometimes they're misunderstood. They're implemented, but maybe not with a full understanding of what they could or should be. The first one is zero trust. We see a lot of folks who just cringe at this term because it creates, now I got to do multi-factor authentication. It's going to slow me down. Again, we're in manufacturing. We want to go. So zero trust can be frustrating, especially if you've got a diverse supply chain or you're working with a lot of different people. Talk to us a little bit about how zero trust can be implemented correctly. So it's not going to slow you down. It's going to do what it's supposed to.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, zero trust is like this philosophy. So that, I kind of want to set that straight, because when I hear there's a lot of terms that get floated around inside of the cybersecurity world, right? Where we've seen CASB and DLP and a lot of these things that we've talked about in the past. And now we're kind of coming back to this term that's called zero trust. I think the NIST zero trust framework is super good. If anybody wants to go give that a read, it kind of lays out the different parts of a zero trust framework that you should think about. But from my perspective, it doesn't have to be onerous from the end user's perspective. A lot of that should be taken care of behind the scenes, from my perspective, where when you're on the network, you have a zero trust solution that makes sure that devices can only talk to devices, or your laptop can only talk to these devices. A lot of that should be handled by the IT and the security teams behind the scenes, right? I think there is still a little bit of a learning curve from the end user when it comes to things like multi-factor authentication. I just had a customer the other day that I was talking to about this, and he was talking about having to put in an exception for the CEO because the CEO didn't want to keep, every day have to do an MFA, right? I'm not a fan of that. I advise against it, but I think the thing that you can do there is just enforce it, but don't make it overly complicated, right? Meaning, obviously passwords are still required, but don't make them so difficult that they'll never remember them, or they can't reuse a password ever. I got so mad at a system that I was working on the other day because I used a password 5 times ago and it won't let me do it. I'm like, what the heck? That's so silly, right? So what I say is make it as easy as possible. Have an MFA solution that literally is just a tap on the phone. Make it as transparent as they can, because a lot of the zero trust framework should be happening behind the scenes, as far as we're going to make sure that this computer talks securely to this SaaS system, or it talks securely to the cloud system, right? So that's my general perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point too. Smart does not need to be complex. We don't need to make this so hard so we're writing passwords down and gets away from exactly what we want zero trust to do. I think that's a great point.
Yes.
Another thing I wanted to bring up, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're spot on. Like, I think overly complicated just frustrates the end users, and it makes you, I think, ultimately less secure, because then you end up with people doing, things like writing passwords on a, like my son did. I found a password on my refrigerator the other day that I told him that my 10-year-old couldn't remember in his head. Yeah. And I'm like, well, thanks, buddy.
Yeah. The other term I want to throw at you, again, not new, not novel, but often I think overcomplicated and sometimes misunderstood. And as a result, people don't use it the way it could be. And that's microsegmentation. We started what was segmenting a lot of our networks, especially in the OT environment, because it makes a lot of sense. But then we realized, again, with a lot of embedded software, with a lot of secure by design measures, we need to go a step further and take it to a microsegmentation level. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about some of the common missteps. And again, this doesn't have to be as complex as some folks make it out to be.
Yeah. I'll be maybe slightly controversial, where Um, Microsegmentation can be very hard. And for people that don't have the resources to do it, they're not going to do it well, right? So, like, if you get back to the whole kind of like the whole zero trust thing, um, it it needs to be kind of behind the scenes, and it needs to be where not everybody can needs to see it. But microsegmentation can be a little bit difficult because you're always having to do updates. Like I mentioned, for the most part, server A will always talk to server B and not server C. And that's fine when we're talking about three servers. But in a realistic environment where you're talking about uh, potentially multiple cloud providers with hundreds of thousands of servers, microsegmentation gets really, really crazy really fast. And if even in more industrial environments where maybe you're talking about, 5 to 10 cloud environments and a few thousand servers, for the IT teams or the cloud security teams that are strapped already, microsegmentation just becomes a little bit difficult. So what I tend to see people do is maybe do it more by groups or roles inside of the cloud environment, right? Where, this particular group of servers are assigned a role that allows them to do, these 10 things. And that applies to users as well. That tends to be more successful than microsegmentation in my view. I'm not saying microsegmentation never needs to happen. There are highly regulated, super secure networks where that makes total sense. But I think to the lay people, especially when you're strapped, maybe focus on grouping them and just having specific servers groups that can talk to other ones. And you can use some tools. I did mention identity security a little bit earlier. So one of the things that you can do is you can do kind of constant analysis of overly permissive roles. So say that you start out by assigning specific roles to specific machines to do specific tasks. If over time those are found that maybe you don't need all of those, then you can take some of those permissions back. And that's where like there's not to throw a lot of terms out there, but KIM for your cloud identity and entitlement management, that's where that can really come in and help you. So that's the approach that I typically take is utilize groups, roles, permissions, rather than microsegmentation of dictating exactly who can talk to what.
Yeah. Well, I think when I look at segmentation strategies generally, I think it kind of applies the same as when you mentioned some of the frameworks before. They're there. You can cherry pick a little bit. You can figure out what works best. It doesn't need to be 0 or 100 in terms of your buy-in. Figure out what works and implement it appropriately. And that's why I like to talk about some of these terms, because there's a lot of people, and when they present their opinions, which is fair, they're going all in. Know that you have a custom environment as well. Figure out what works best. These are all just strategies out there. Like I said, cherry pick them a little bit.
That's a great point. Maybe you've got a PCI network and you want to do some microsegmentation on your PCI network. You always, you can pinpoint those down. Or maybe you've got a network that is FedRAMP, right? That you use to share information with the government, or the government uses your software. Maybe you want to focus on microsegmentation there. Everything doesn't have to be the same. I mean, we see that all the time with production versus test versus dev, right? Where we have folks that say, these are the controls that I want to provide on my production network. I'm going to relax it a little bit on my developer network just because there's going to be a lot of experimenting going on, right? So that's a great point.
Excellent. Tim, covered a bunch of stuff here. This has been awesome. Really appreciate the time. When you look ahead a little bit, and this is the question I like to wrap up a lot of these conversations with, what are some of the biggest trends that you see coming down the pike? I mean, excuse me, we've talked about AI. We've talked about the human factor. Are there other things that you're seeing that could have an impact, year and a half down the road?
I think the biggest thing from my perspective, not to overly AI it, but I think that we'll start to see maybe I'm going to put it out there, I'm going to call it like a self-healing cloud, right? Where not only where the cloud solution, cloud security solution be able to find the issues and surface them, but they'll have the ability to go and fix it because you have a lot of automation that's built in and powered by AI. I'm a big fan of trust but verify, so I won't come out and say, universally do this and turn it on. But I think we're going to start to see that more We've had a couple of missteps along the way with, some security data warehouses that maybe haven't quite taken off. But I think that with AI kind of going the course that it has, I think we'll start to see kind of those agents that can go and do that. And the other thing that I'll start to say is I don't think we'll see quantum computing mainstream, but I think we'll start to see our cybersecurity team starting to prepare for what that's going to mean when quantum is more mainstream. Like we'll make some more progress on the algorithms for encryption that are quantum proof. I think we'll start to see more people talking about it. In no way will be ready. It's not going to be mainstream, but I think in probably the next 18 months to 2 years, maybe we'll kind of come around the corner and that will start to be a little bit more mainstream, at least having the conversation.
Well, anything we can do so people aren't so afraid of agentic AI, very positive. So I'm glad you brought that up. True. And I agree with you too when it comes to quantum. Just having those conversations, that's also going to quell a lot of fears and help us to prepare better when the time comes. So great points.
100%.
Thanks, Tim. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check him out at orca.security. I'd also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Tim Chase, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.